If you're a software developer, you need to learn how to use the ChatGPT API. In this video, I'll walk you through what ChatGPT is and how to use their API in your own software projects. So if you want to learn how to use the GPT API, continue watching this video. To start building with the OpenAI API, we're going to have to set up our environment first. I'll be using a Mac and we'll be working with Python in this tutorial, but the information you will learn throughout this video should apply for all systems and languages. I will link the OpenAI API in the description so you can find the commands for your operating system and language of your choice. First, start by downloading Python if you haven't already installed it. I will have a link to the web address for downloading it. And make sure you have 3.7.1 plus installed, since this is the version of Python that the API requires. To check your Python version, just run python -- version in your terminal. It should say Python followed by your version number. Mine meets and exceeds the version number required, so we're good to go. Next, we're going to create a directory to house all of our source code. I'll call mine Learn GPT.
So now let's just change directories into the one we just made. We can do this by running cd learn GPT.
Next, we're going to set up our virtual environment. You don't have to do this, but it is highly recommended. You can even ask ChatGPT how to do this for your operating system if you need to. If you're on Mac, the command to create your virtual environment is python -mvenv. And to activate it, it is source and /bin /activate. Sweet. So now that we have our virtual environment activated, we have to install the OpenAI library. OpenAI has created a library for developers to make it even easier to make calls to their API. To install it, use the command pip install -- upgrade OpenAI. Next, we will create a .env file and a .gitignore file. We will add the env and the .env to gitignore so we don't keep track of these files. After this, you want to go to the OpenAI's website to create an account and get an API key. So to do this, go to their API key section on their website. I'll link it down in the description or in this video right here, right now, and select create new secret key. This is needed so that OpenAI knows that you are authenticated and you are allowed to make API calls. We're going to copy this API key and add it to our .env file. Finally, you will load some money into ChatGPT to use their API. Otherwise, the calls will fail. So you will simply get a not enough funds error. To add funds, just go to settings, billing, and make sure to add some credits. You don't have to add a lot since the API call is only a couple of cents. I would add somewhere between $5 to $10 just to get started. So now that our environment is set up, let's finally start making some API calls to GPT. First, let's create our app.py file. This is where we'll write all of our code. Next, let's import OpenAI's library and import OpenAI. We will create a client object by writing client equals OpenAI, open parentheses, close parentheses, which we will use to communicate with the GPT API. Let's make sure this is all working as intended by running our code. When you run python app.py, our code will try to make a connection to the API. And if it is successful, nothing will happen so far. But if we get an error, this is the time that we'll find it. Okay, so we get a connection error because the environment variable for the API key wasn't loaded correctly. To fix this, we'll use python .env and we'll load our environment variables using load.env parentheses. This is just a helpful Python library to load environment variables. We're trying to get the environment variable, which is the API key that we placed in the .env file. So let's try running that again and hopefully we get it. Awesome. Okay, sweet. So now that we actually got it, let's actually write our first request by writing completion equals client.chat.completions.create and then parentheses. Now let's add a field called model to define the model that we will be using. Let's use GPT 3.5 Turbo first. So what we've written so far is basically the boilerplate for an API call to GPT. We're just using their OpenAI client and defining a model so far. But next, we will define the messages field in our request. The messages field is really important. It is a list of objects where each message object has a role with values that map to either system, user, or assistant. The system role is important for programming the model. Essentially, the system role allows us, the programmers, to tell GPT how it should behave. For example, we can write role is the system and the content is you are a poetic assistant that likes to rhyme with every response you produce. This message should tell GPT to rhyme in each response it produces. So let's add this message to our API call so far. Now, if we wanted GPT to actually output something, let's add a new message object, but this time with the role of a user. You can think of the user role as someone who is actually using your GPT app. Just like you use the ChatGPT web app, you are the user requesting some information. In this case, let's ask our assistant how to print hello world in Python. We can do this by adding a message object to our messages list like so. Cool, so let's just throw this role user and the content, write me a script to print hello world in Python. Now let's test our code by printing our response and running this code. Now the response looks a little messy, but let's take a look at the important parts. ChatGPT will respond with a chat completion object. The chat completion object has a ton of fields that have information about GPT's response to our prompt. If we look through the response, we can see that there is a choices field with a list of response choices to choose from. We'll just retrieve the first response by getting index 0 of the choices field. And then we will get the chat completion message object by selecting the message field of the choice object. In other words, we can simply just retrieve the message that GPT responded with by using this line of code. Just like the message objects we created earlier to program and prompt GPT, this message field from GPT's response also has a role and has a content field. Now that we've isolated the chat completion message object, we can retrieve the actual content of GPT's response using the field content. So we can just write print response message and then the content of that message. This will strictly print the content that GPT responded with. In our case, how to print hello world in Python, but in an explanation that rhymes. If we want to get the role that ChatGPT played in the response, we can use the role field to retrieve that, and you will see that it played the role of an assistant. So we just print response message.role, you get assistant. Now let's quickly go back to printing our chat completion object. If we look closely, we can see that our choice object contains a finish reason. For this example, it is stop, which means that ChatGPT returned a complete message for its response to the user prompt. However, there are a number of reasons why GPT will stop creating output, and these are listed on their website, but I've also attached them below. So feel free to pause and take a quick look at them. Among a list of reasons why GPT will stop is due to length. This means that GPT has reached its token limit, either due to the model's limits or the limits that you impose as a developer. It shouldn't be too much of a problem also if you're just building small web applications, but I suggest looking into it a little further if you're going to build something more larger. Now, is ChatGPT even fun if you can only call a model once? Nah, not really. Ideally, you want to be able to talk to GPT in a conversation, and you'd expect GPT to remember your past conversations. So to do this, all we have to do is add a new message object to our list of messages. In this case, I'll add this message object to our new messages array and make a new call. So I'll write role is the user, that's me, who's using the GPT, and I'll write now, write it in Java. For this to work, GPT needs to remember the previous prompts in order to know what it is writing in Java, right? Earlier, we asked it to print hello world in Python, but now we want it in Java. So if this works correctly, it should return how to print hello world in Java, but in a way that also rhymes. So let's see if it did it correctly. Nice. So each time we want to prompt GPT with a new question, we need to keep track of the messages list and make a new API call. Awesome. So far we've learned what GPT is, how we can call their API to generate text, and how to keep track of conversations between the model and the user. There is one additional functionality I would like to talk about in this video, and that is JSON mode. First, what is JSON mode and why would we want to use it? There are times as developers, we wish that we had a consistent way of retrieving data. This is why we like to use APIs, because we are guaranteed that information will be returned in a formatted scheme. For instance, we've seen ChatGPT's message object field has a role and a content field. So this way, we know that if we want to retrieve the actual content of GPT's response, we just have to retrieve it using the content field for the message field. In other words, we can rely on this command to consistently retrieve the content from GPT's response. But what if we could ask GPT to write output in JSON so that we can have it consistently return response in a formatted and easy to process manner? We can do this using the field response format, and we're going to give it a type of JSON object. This is just telling GPT that it's always going to have to respond in JSON. In order for this to work though, we need to upgrade our model. So let's use GPT 3.5 Turbo -1106. Now in our prompt, we must include the word JSON or you'll get some error. We just got to tell GPT model how to structure the output. It doesn't know how to, so we got to tell it what to do. I want GPT to always return a JSON object that has a field named code where I can retrieve any code written by the model, and another field named rhyme explanation to retrieve the explanation of the code, but in a way that rhymes. So let's instruct GPT to do this in the system message by adding a role of system and a content of your response must be in JSON, where there is a code field that has any written code and a rhyme explanation where the code is explained but in a way that rhymes. So let's see how this changes our output by running our app. Awesome. Okay, so it works as expected, but remember, this isn't actually JSON just yet. This is a string that looks like JSON. Python can't just process this, and we can't just retrieve a key from this JSON, right? We have to change it into our proper JSON by using the Python JSON library.
We can start by importing the JSON library at the top, and then use the JSON.loads function to load the content string we got from GPT. JSON loads will process the string and turn it into something Python can actually use. We can store the JSON in a variable, and then retrieve the code field using using the code key, and we can retrieve the explanation using the rhyme explanation key. Now, let's run our code to see if this works.
Awesome, and it works. So this wraps up today's tutorial. I hope you've learned a thing or two, but you've at least learned the basics you need to integrate GPT into your own code and to build fun things with it. I'll be releasing more videos in the future about GPT and how to use it in upcoming videos. If this is something that you might be interested in, remember to subscribe. Or if you like today's video and you learned something new, remember to also subscribe or like the video. Your feedback is gonna help me figure out if I should keep on doing this coding on the internet thing, because not gonna lie, it's slightly weird. Anyway, let me know and hit that subscribe button. Peace.